Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, a partner here at Cimpatico Studios. Cimpatico is a platform dedicated to cultivating conversations and actions on complex social issues with professionals all around the world. On the Climate.Edu channel, I interview academics about university programs, careers, research, internships, and published literature like books and papers. If you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now, on to today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back to Climate.Edu. I am your host, Kayla Hathaway, and today I'm joined by Eric Martin. Eric Martin is the Managing Director of Adaptive Change Advisors, an organization that seeks to democratize leadership, making it possible for anyone, anywhere, to improve their livelihood by more effectively mobilizing people in their organizations, communities, and in their own lives. Today, Eric is going to be introducing us to his book, Your Leadership Moment: Democratizing Leadership in an Age of Authoritarianism. He defines leadership moments, adaptive change, and discusses the importance of democratizing leadership. Eric, thank you so much for joining me today. How are things on your end?
Looking forward to this conversation. Things are good. Yeah, I mean, not much happening in the world.
Just not much at all, you know.
We can talk about some of that. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm great. Thank you.
I'm really glad to hear. And since this is definitely a hefty book with a bunch of interesting definitions and life lessons, go ahead and dive right on into it. And my first question, just to define what we're looking at, can you go ahead and tell us what exactly a leadership moment is as you use it in your book?
Yeah, well, yeah, and thanks again for the opportunity. This the book really, for me, was a response that I had to make to the frustration I'd been feeling, seeing the progress that we were trying to make on climate for many years kind of go south for the last 4 years. And to be honest with you, just trying to talk to people in my own family. I grew up in the city of Detroit, which is kind of a purple state, so we don't all agree on all things policy. And so I wanted to really inspire people who don't see themselves as leaders to seize these leadership moments. So, what is a leadership moment? Well, first of all, it's important to say that leadership is not a person. It's not about charisma. It's not about vision. All these things we typically talk about as leadership. Those are resources to lead. But I found it much more helpful to see it as a moment. It's something that you do. It's not something that you are. And in fact, there's 5 leadership moments that most of us face every single day. So the question that animates me and my work in this book is, would you recognize a leadership moment when it came your way? And would you know what to do when it did? So a leadership moment is a daily opportunity that anyone can take to create change. It's the moment where maybe your heart leaps with hopeful anticipation or with fear of taking that next step. It's a moment that holds promise for a long-awaited breakthrough, or as I like to say oftentimes, the more beautiful world that our heart knows is possible, to use a phrase coined by Charles Eisenstein. So leadership moments are these kind of very common everyday situations that often skip by our awareness. And part of the reason why that happens, we'll talk maybe more about this later on, is that they also hold the uncomfortable possibility that you too need to change. And so, these people who engage in leadership moments speak up, they stand up, they ask questions in a meeting that no one else will ask. And sometimes, as we've seen in the NFL, they even take a knee in a form of patriotic protest. So that's a bit of what a leadership moment is. And, just as maybe for folks listening in here now, to take a minute to think about and reflect on the last time you faced a leadership moment. Maybe it was when a family member decided, or you decided to call out a racist uncle at Thanksgiving Day dinner. That was a leadership moment. Or when your friend took the risk to confront you about your polarizing political rant on Facebook rather than becoming complicit in it. That's a leadership moment. So when I'm talking about leadership moments, I'm talking about something so simple, it's really easy to miss. In fact, one last thing I'll say about that is I had an interview the other day with a woman who was the first Danish Muslim woman, not prime minister, member of parliament.
Oh.
She wrote a book. Yeah, she wrote a book, and it's worth reading. I have to find the title for you if you want to know. But she wrote about having a cup of coffee with an enemy because had been getting death threats to herself and her family, And rather than react as most of us would, as I would have, she invited him to a cup of coffee. So even a cup of coffee can have a leadership moment somewhere embedded in it.
That's incredible. I can only imagine like the kind of like just comfort and like mental strength to just be willing to sit down and be like, okay, so I know you've been saying all these things. Let's have a nice discussion about it.
Right.
I definitely would love to like read her book and like also just learn more about this person because that's I know I am not in that mental like strong position at this point in my life for sure.
Yeah, I mean, few of us are. It's leadership moments are risky. You have to learn something. You have to maybe even give something up, and that's why we don't see leadership, frankly, from people in leadership. It's kind of ironic, but the people who we call leaders, if we were more precise with our language, we would call them people in authority or people with big spans of control. It's really hard for people who have that kind of visibility and that kind of pressure on them to deliver to engage in these leadership moments, which is why we need to democratize leadership. And each of us, as I said, have about 5 a day, so it's there if we can see it.
Yeah, and with the so going to like the five, I think it was like five types of leadership moments that you see.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you go ahead and give us like a couple of well, you gave us some examples earlier, like with calling out the Facebook posts or your family over dinner. But if we're taking a look, maybe say in like climate adaptation or climate justice, what would like a leadership moment look like?
Yeah, there's so many, and I'm happy to share more. The one that I'll just share here because it's probably something we can all identify with, or at least identify, is Greta Thunberg.
Mm.
And not to I don't want to overuse her as an example, but it's such a great example. She not just the visible stuff, not just the sailing to North America rather than flying for the climate summit, her famous "How dare you" speech, but even before that, well before that, she led a strike at school, and her parents initially didn't support her activism, which is again an example when you're facing or fighting down or facing down the status quo. When people in authority, like parents or teachers, push back, that is a sign that you might be engaging in a leadership moment. And it could also be a sign that you're a jerk. You're not going to get that resistance unless you're really pushing on something that's important to people. So I think
Yeah.
that's a good example. And what many people don't know about her is she has I think it's what is it? Asperger's syndrome
Yeah.
and mutism, right? And so for her to step beyond that kind of protective bubble that she could have stayed in is why it takes courage. And leadership moments beget more leadership moments. She actually said she was inspired by high schoolers who, and she got the idea of the climate strike after the school shootings here in the U.S. back in February 2018. And it led to several of these youths refusing to go back to school. And they later went on to organize a March for Our Lives, as they called it, I think, in support of gun control. So it just shows you how these, people you would never think of as a leader, no one who gave her authority to do that? Who gave them authority to do that? And so if we wait for someone in authority to tell us, okay, it's time to lead, it's safe now, it'll never happen. I think
And
that's one example. Yeah.
yeah, and so like kind of like going off from that, like just how a lot of mentality it seems like, oh, like I'll wait for someone else to go ahead and start. It seems to be really, really common. And especially if we're taking a look at like just how big of an issue climate change is. It's like, oh, well, someone else will figure it out, and then maybe I'll go ahead and help out, throw some money their way, especially in terms of like uh, political leadership or like political authority. Like, go ahead and try to use the proper words, like so political authority and like representation. And there seems to be more of a conversation now about like, well, if you're not seeing yourself being represented, then you should go and represent yourself and run for these kinds of positions. Um, and so kind of like leading in with that, like talking about adaptive change and what like the definition is in your book and how we can go and just kind of change these systems to better suit good change.
Yeah. So adaptive change it's a kind of an idea. It's a piece of jargon, but it's really useful. It comes from this framework of adaptive leadership, which was developed at Harvard Kennedy School about 35 years ago. And so I've been working over the last 15, 20 years with two of the professors at Harvard, Dr. Ronnie Heifetz and Marty Linsky. as well as Alexander Grashow, who really was responsible for taking this work out of the Kennedy School into the real world, as I like to say. And and adaptive leadership is a framework. It's a set of tools, techniques, practices for leading change when you don't have easy answers. When the problems you face uh, don't have solutions that are known, or maybe not even knowable. I mean, for example, with climate change, if I were to ask you what's the solution, we could have a big debate about that. And in fact, if I asked what's the problem, we could have a big debate about that, and including people that would say there is no problem at all. So in these situations where there's not a clear problem or a clear solution, which is what we call an adaptive problem, the work of leadership there is about creating change that involves the people who are facing the problem, not just giving them easy answers. And I mean, you could take, say, geoengineering as an example. I don't know where you are on that spectrum, and I guess I could entertain a possibility somewhere down the line that geoengineering would be a viable last minute, approach. But it's a very technical solution to what is a really a behavioral question. It's a societal question. There's a lot there that you just can't um, put on the backs of engineers. And to take a non-climate example, which I think is really relevant now, given all that's happening in the U.S., is fake news and the role of Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, for example, in censoring the president. Now, I'm not commenting on the politics of that so much as asking why, what is it that we like to see and hear and like and retweet in these posts that we would need to change or interrogate if we were to really come together as a country and, as I said, democratize leadership, which includes working through conflict in a life-giving, creative way, not in a
Mhm.
destructive way. So when we kind of offload that responsibility to algorithms, to engineers at Google, despite how well-intentioned they may be, we're really missing the point. And that kind of change, the adaptive change, is where people really take responsibility for having the courageous conversations, doing the hard work of leadership. And that's what really is what sustains systems and changes systems over time. So that's kind of a little bit about technical and adaptive change. I could share some personal examples too, because these adaptive challenges are everywhere in our own personal lives. An aging parent, for example, raising kids, getting a new apartment complex, even sometimes can have its own adaptive challenges. It's not all cut and dried. So yeah.
Yeah, no, there's definitely we can like dive into the examples on that. Like just bringing up well, let's see. So like go ahead and nitpick a maybe like an environmental justice example. Um see off the top of my head would be maybe like refineries um in like lower income areas. Like how could we go and utilize like adaptive change and like
Mhm.
democratizing leadership and just leadership moments in order to go and correct the environmental like injustice in a situation like that.
Yeah. Um, I saw a great article the other day. I think it was the Sierra Club. I don't look at their website very often, but they were talking about how when you're looking at where these refineries are built, they're often throwaway places, is how they're described. It's like, well, we can kind of dump our garbage here, and it doesn't matter because the people in those places are considered throwaway people. I mean, that's a painful thing to say, and I don't agree with that. But it's this view that the people don't matter, and so um, how do we change that? Where does that mentality coming from? That kind of dehumanization, as it were, which is also the same template for racism, dehumanization. So, I'd want to begin to look at not just where do we place the site, but why are we choosing that site? How much engagement is there happening with the local community? I mean, these are kind of obvious questions, but they don't happen because they're not expedient. They're not necessary in many cases. You can just kind of plow through. Maybe another example that's less about environmental justice. This is a woman I know who used to work at she was brought in to run clean energy for an electric company, a power company, and she had a very technical approach to this coming in. She came in and told the plant managers about the benefits of solar. You can imagine, right? The PowerPoint presentations, the
Yeah.
the carbon counting, all that kind of stuff.
Like here's all
And
my
found that
beautiful charts. Like yeah.
yeah, it's so obvious. Like this is the right thing. It's gonna be quiet, and you have to do less work, and it's safer, and all that. And got a tremendous amount of resistance. And then she spent time with these plant managers. Actually walked, the grounds with them, got to know them, and she began to realize that the sense of pride, the ownership they felt as professionals, was around safety. These are guys, and they're mostly guys, who would just at the sniff of some kind of diesel in the air knew that there was an explosion about to happen. Like
Mm.
that took a tremendous amount of pride and years of skill to develop. They would feel the vibrations on the floor, on the plant floor, and know that a certain piece of machinery needed fixing. And here she was saying, "Oh, it's gonna be quiet. You could just," she literally said, "You could just put sheep to mow the fields, and that's pretty much all the maintenance you need to do." So she saw that she had to talk about this differently. She had to really understand where they were coming from, the grandparents, the grandfathers that they felt connected to doing this kind of work, the language that she used. So she started talking about the fleet of solar arrays instead of other ways of talking, because they talked about the fleet of coal plants. So
Oh,
just the language
interesting.
piece of that, right? Yeah, and it's again, it's not about messaging. It's not just about framing, but it's about understanding where these people come from. How do I engage them where they are, and not just try to convince them with facts, logic? Because we all know, I mean, we see it nowadays, right? In
Oh yeah.
politics, facts and logic. It's not that we're not in a post-truth world, but there's many facts and logic to fit what you want to believe. So the question isn't what are the facts; it's what do you want to believe and why. And let's get to that core. So I don't want to take it too deep, but that's kind of another example.
No, I mean, I think that's a really great example, especially if as we look forward into like a new administration coming in, especially now with what has happened with the Senate, um, and the conversation around like climate or just more environmental like policy and green energy has definitely been a big discussion, especially out here in California. I think
Hmm.
this year or yeah, it is 2021 now. Like having policy where like all new construction is going to have like solar panels. And if I remember correctly, there was an article talking about phasing out gasoline and diesel powered like new production of those vehicles by 2030, if
Yeah.
I remember correctly. So I think there's definitely a lot of space to talk about like how we should be phrasing things and how we can go and kind of like reach out to people who are very not really wanting change. Like before our show talking about like agriculture and the need to reach out to like ranchers and farmers about this kind of thing too.
Yeah. Yeah, Gina McCarthy, who was a former EPA head, said her biggest regret was not doing just that. She kind of went in with the way most leaders do: is here's the answers, here's solutions, we can make it easy for you, we'll provide funding even, and got tremendous resistance. So that engagement, a lot of this leadership work is about engagement. Yeah, and I really this might be a bit controversial to say on this channel, so you tell me. But I think um, another way to think about how can I position it. So a lot of the climate dialogue, and I've been a part of creating this dialogue myself over the past 20 years, has been around carbon, right? Carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions. And we all understand why. We all know the numbers we need to hit, the 350, or maybe it's going to be 400 now because 350 seems out of reach. And that makes sense. I mean, that was a huge ounce of progress to make after so many years of people just not even knowing the science of climate. Um, but you could clear cut a hardwood forest, as often happens. You could, there's a lot you could do to increase the carbon counting to make that look good, and actually destroy some of the ecosystem that really, in many ways, plays a much greater role. Soil health is one thing we talked about earlier on. So, I'm really interested to see as the Biden administration comes on board, how they frame the clean energy conversation. How much, for example, with the 2023 Farm Bill coming up, that's a huge opportunity to take those billions that would otherwise be invested in euthanizing cattle and destroying corn, and really plow that into soil health and really restore a sense of dignity to these farmers whose livelihoods have been taken away from them by big ag. So it's kind of controversial sometimes because people say, well, gosh, you can't talk like that because we just it took so much to get the carbon conversation on the table. But I think soil health, the water cycle, a lot of things, that if we don't take care of those, we could still die a death of a million cuts and carbon will go down. So that's an example to me of, if anyone took that stand in the clean energy community, that would be a leadership moment. And people are doing it, but it's hard, particularly as, frankly, the clean energy system, becomes much more influenced by the usual financial interests. It's
Oh yeah.
a lot of, rich white men who are doing this. And listen, I have nothing against rich white men per se, but the last thing we want to do is create, the same system in new garb. And I think there's a risk in the climate space of us doing just that. And so this is a really critical moment these next 4 years for people who see what's on the horizon, see some of the old patterns that are getting recreated, even in, for a sensible good, and say, what do we do about that? And I would love to see more of that kind of leadership.
No, I completely agree. And with that as well, we have just hit our end time already.
Is that?
Yeah, no. So go ahead and we will be, I think it's next week. Yes, we're doing it weekly. We will be diving in to part two of leadership moment. And if you want to go ahead and give us like a little preview of what like part two of your book consists of before we go ahead and wrap up here.
Yeah, so right on topic, we'll be looking at the leadership that a gentleman in West Virginia, a military vet, is exercising on precisely these kind of issues. His name is John Gensler, a great man, good friend. And I think the invitation for folks who are listening in now and next week is just to begin to notice these leadership moments in your own life. Don't do anything about them just yet. It could be dangerous to do anything about them. Just become aware of them. And trust that when that happens, there'll be something will kind of well up of courage and insight, and we can talk more maybe on the next call about how to do that.
Yeah, I think that would be a really great discussion and definitely especially relevant. All right, I'm going to go ahead and roll our end credits and we'll be right back for our post-show discussion.